So my name is Branden Lee, as previously introduced, and today I'll be exploring free will. This exploration will start at the fundamental nature versus nurture debate and how it explains our lack of free will, then the impact of this concession onto our justice system, the connection from this philosophical concept to a theological one, and the overall common denominator that connects both atheism and religion. So to really understand this, we had to go back to September 2016. As previously mentioned, I debated for 4 years, and in my senior year, there was a completely new event called Big Questions. The resolution read as, under science, there is no room for free will. After a long day of debate, I came home rejuvenated with a new revelation, and I ran to my sister and I told her that if I smacked her across the face, that it would not be my fault. She laughed at me, and then she slapped me across the face and said it wasn't her fault. You see, despite me being slapped, the logic behind what I said was impeccable. But to understand that, let's go even more back, to 5 to 7 years ago maybe, to our high school biology class. You see, we learned two very important things in our high school biology class. One, that the mitochondria is a powerhouse of the cell. And two, that our actions are completely determined by a counterbalance between nature and nurture. And the latter is a more important concept in understanding why we don't have free will. You see, free will is defined as the apparent human ability to make choices that are not externally determined. This is extremely important because if you notice in the nature versus nurture debate, those are the only two characteristics. Those are the only two factors that determine all of our actions. According to Stephen Cave of The Atlantic, in recent decades, research on the inner workings of the brain has helped to resolve the nature-nurture debate and has dealt a further blow to the idea of free will. There is agreement in the scientific community that the firing of neurons determines not just some or most, but all of our thoughts, hopes, memories, and dreams. This is extremely important to note because our neurons and all of our cells in our body are determined by nature and nurture, genetics and environment. And do we have any control over them? Absolutely not. They're all externally determined, and we know that by asking two questions. One, can you determine where you were born? Absolutely not. Unless you were a fetus forcing your mother to go to a certain place, that's very unlikely. At the end of the day, your parents decided where you were born, meaning that you had no control over the environment you were placed in. Similarly, can you determine what genes you were born with? Absolutely not. And because we don't have any control, that makes those two things externally determined. And since all of our actions come from our brain, and those actions are externally determined, our actions are also externally determined, meaning that we don't have any free will. And this means that we don't have any responsibility for any of our actions. And this has profound implications, specifically in our justice system. You see, our justice system is predicated on the idea of penalizing others for their wrongdoings to society or to other individuals in that society. But if you're not responsible for your actions, then is it really just to punish you for that? Similarly, in America, we have the insanity defense in our courts. The rationale behind this is that those with psychiatric disorders cannot distinguish between right or wrong, therefore they shouldn't be punished. But on the converse of that, can you really be guilty of any punishment if you had no volition in committing those crimes? If your actions were dictated by your genes and environment alone, should there be any punishment at all? And the answer to that is a maybe. You see, it depends on how you perceive punishment in itself. Is it a deterrent or a retribution? You see, if you believe that punishment is retribution, that if you do something wrong to another person, that we have the right to do something wrong to you, then by that logic, we shouldn't have any punishment at all. Why? Because we didn't have responsibility for any of our actions. However, if you believe that punishment is a deterrent, that if you do something wrong, we should put you in jail to prevent you from doing something wrong again, this concept still has implications, simply because we have capital punishment. And the logic behind that is they did something so reprehensible that we need to execute them. But by that logic, if they did nothing wrong and punishment is simply a deterrent, that makes the entire concept of capital punishment invalidated. So really, if you take into account what free will really is and how it doesn't exist in society, then that modifies our perception of the entire justice system and the purpose of punishment itself. However, this isn't the end of it. It's not simply that there is no free will and we're mindless machines in this cog, in this huge machine of society. No, it goes a little deeper than that, simply because there is a potential of religion existing. There is always possibility of a free will if there is a God. And the reason for that is perhaps there is a supreme force that gave free will upon you in a way that science just can't understand, that contemporary scientists just can't really perceive or really apprehend. And for that matter, it opens the door for free will to exist if you believe in a God, making this an important theological concept. And this theological concept was a profound one for me personally. You see, after realizing this, I went through sort of an existential crisis. You see, how can you continue to go on living, not believing in a God? If you don't believe in a God, that means that free will doesn't exist. Can you really continue going on in your life, believing that you're predisposed to literally everything that you do, that your entire life was predetermined for you? This adds a whole new dimension to a question that has been asked throughout the entirety of humanity about whether or not there is actually a God. So, for me personally, it made me really question my faith, because I think this is something that literally all of us struggle with. It's a concept that all of us tackle with every day about whether or not there's a supreme force, whether or not there's a God, and whether or not you should believe in that God. But understand that if you don't believe in a God, you also have to concede the fact that free will doesn't exist. But it's not as morbid as that. There is a hopeful step forward, because there's a common denominator, whether or not you believe in a God. And that common denominator is that there is always room for compassion. Now, it might seem a little cliche. I mean, we've heard this all the times. Love your neighbors, be compassionate, share your toys in kindergarten. I mean, we've been taught our entire lives to share with other people and to be compassionate. But it's not just me emotionally telling you that. Just use simple logic. You see, we tend to judge other people. We tend to hate other people. We say that this person is a bigot, or this person says things that I don't agree with, and therefore I don't like that person. But what you have to understand is that the actions of people and the words of people are not separated from their environment, meaning that they were predisposed to their conditions. They were predisposed to literally all their actions. So instead of hating that specific person, you have to understand that you have to hate where they came from, or what caused them to actually do that, not the person themselves. But that's only looking at it through atheism. If you look at this through religion, you should automatically be compassionate. Why? Well, because the Bible tells you so. But even if you don't believe in a God, even if you believe in the gods of Greek mythology, and you believe that Zeus gave you free will, you still have to concede the fact that Zeus himself was the one that determined how much free will you were going to get. That Zeus was the one that determined whether or not you're going to have free will. Therefore, even if you believe in a God, that still means that that free will was handed to you by an external force, once again, leaving you to a limited free will that a God handed to you. So therefore, if you want to, once again, judge somebody for their actions, you have to understand that that action not only derives from their genes and environment, but also a concept of free will that was handed by an external force. So therefore, this conversation just doesn't end with the simple fact that you should be compassionate. It goes profoundly deeper than that, simply because this question and this concept speaks to the human condition. I hope that we all use this topic and this concept to add perspective, whether you're talking about intellectual conversations, about politics, religion, or identity, because this is something that applies to all of us, and therefore all of humanity. Thank you.